Well, now let's turn to Bob Davidson and his workshop, Tools, Tips. Bob, welcome.
Thank you, Jim. Let's get right into it. And I trust everybody can see that.
Yes, sir.
So welcome to Workshop Tips and Tricks. One thing, just going back to Phil's thing, I'm on a Mac platform, and a lot of what Phil is doing is compatible in Keynote, which is the Mac version. And that whole idea with putting in the no fill, pardon the pun, no fill, no stroke boxes, that's great. I never thought of doing that in 30 years. So thank you, Phil. Anyway, what we're doing here is sharing some tips and tricks from my career in the theater and exhibits as a carpenter and a designer. So tonight's main topic is getting it together. We're kind of getting into the nuts and bolts of everything, literally. First, we'll look at some screws. You've probably seen a lot of these, just standard straight taper Phillips heads and slotted screws, drywall screws. I right now tend to use square drive. There are many different drives you can see here on the bottom, star drives and Torx drives, and I've now switched over pretty much only to using square drive screws. They don't spin out on you, and I just have had a lot of luck with it. So, but these are just some of the many different types of screws that are out there. Screw sizes typically are done by numbers. So number 1 is a real tiny screw. Number 2s we use you might use a lot in small case work and things like that. Your drywall screws typically are either number 6 or number 8, and then you get into larger screws, 10s and 12s. Typically, you're not going to find larger than a number 12 screw in most hardware stores. So, but this is just a good chart. If you go back and watch this later, it's a good chart just so you know how big some of these screws are. Bolts, lots of different types of bolts. Self-drilling, you can tell by the little drill tip on them. Hex head bolts, carriage bolts, which we use, building decks and things like that. Lag bolts, which is kind of just giant screws. Socket screws, which come a couple different ways, with a taper top, also with a round top. We call them socket drive screws, set screws, obviously eye bolts and stuff. One thing that you may not see a lot in your hardware store, which is really really useful bolt, is called elevator bolts. And those are literally used in elevators. When they build the framework of elevators, they can't have any bolt heads sticking out when they do the interior finishes in the elevator cab. So elevator bolts have a really large but very flat head on them. So you can stick up a panel and it won't encumber the space where you want the panel to fit against the structure of the cab. So we use these quite a bit. Lots of nuts, soup to nuts. So hex nuts, nylocks are very good if you want things not to loosen up on you. So, excuse me, it's just a hex nut with a nylon insert. Jam nuts or half height nuts. You'll see these on drill presses. If you want to do a depth adjustment, you'll have 2 jam nuts and you literally jam them together to lock it in. Wing nuts you'll find, cap nuts, acorns. So again, this is just all kind of just a chart that you might find useful for finding different ways to hold things together. Some things that you may not see everywhere, but I use these quite a bit. A shoulder wing nut is a great wing nut to use if you're holding down. I use these to hold down my my cutter and my sander. I have studs, and then because they're easy to get them off of the counter. And wing bolts are out there as well. So these are all good alternatives. Sizes of bolts I've given you a chart here with both metric and imperial. So M6 is basically a 1/4 inch bolt. This goes by millimeters, so 6 millimeters and up, 1/4 inch and up. You'll see in both there's coarse and fine threads, so the pitch or threads per inch. So a 1/4 20 is how you'll see them listed at the hardware store. That's a coarse thread bolt. That's your typical bolt. Fine thread is if you're in a stress situation, if you want to have a little bit better gripping power, use a fine thread bolt. So again, just interesting data to have. Some specialty bolts that you may not know about, draw bolts. These are used by cabinet or counter installers a lot, but guess what? They're really great if you want to hold modules together. Basically, you just drill out a hole, or you can cut slots, and you use these. You can see this one is made to work with a European hole drill, and then you route out or cut out a slot. Here's one that's more straight. So draw bolts are a good item to have for certain joining projects. I showed T-nuts before. There actually are YouTube videos on the proper way to install T-nuts. We typically countersink them, so we'll take a bore, and so that we're countersinking the plate. And then you see the way that they bend up the tabs that you actually hammer into the wood to hold the T-nut in place. We actually usually put small screws into these recesses to keep the T-nut from falling out. One of the things when you buy a T-nut, you'll see different lengths of the cylinder here. So you want to make sure that you're getting the right length that you want, that because some of these come pretty long. You don't want it obviously sticking through the substrate. Zippets are just a plastic fastener that we use a lot of, typically used for drywall, but they're also good in foam. If you're using a dense foam, a high density foam, zippets are great to hold things in place. So just something to know about that. And you buy these, they're pretty inexpensive. They typically, you can either get them, they'll be packaged with regular pan head sheet metal screws. I tend to just use drywall screws with them because it's a little bit less of a bite and they won't spin out on you. Threaded inserts and rib nuts. So these are what I actually put the studs into in my workbenches. There's a couple different styles. There's a hex drive threaded insert. This is a brass that you put in with it. There's actually a tool, but you can just use a slotted screwdriver. So basically you drill a clearance hole and then you screw this down into it. And it's a great way to affix something flush to any flat surface. Riv nuts we use for tubing, for steel or aluminum tubing. There's a special tool and basically it's a rivet. It sucks this up and it expands into place, but then you can use it to attach a bolt to a piece of steel or aluminum tube. Snap toggles. I love snap toggles. Basically, these are toggles that don't fall into the wall when you take the bolt out of them. These come as small as 1/8 inch I've seen. I typically use 3/16, and they're not just for drywall. You can use these with any plywood to hold things down. Basically, you drill in a 3/16, you drill a 1/2 inch clearance hole. This slides into the hole. You flatten it out, slide this collar down tight against the substrate, and then these tabs snap off. And basically it's a poor man's threaded insert. Really useful. And they typically are packaged with the bolt, so that's good too. Hanger bolts, these are great. If you've got stud walls and you want to put your layout or your framework into it. You'll see these on furniture, on chairs to hold the legs in place. So there's a wood thread and then there's a machine thread. So you can screw them in. Basically, you just put a couple nuts on here, jam nuts, screw it into a hole, and then you now have a stud sticking out of your wooden stud or any other or board, and you can attach and detach So these are called hanger bolts. You want to try to find those. Blind rivets or pop rivets, those are great to use, typically just for sheet metal. You can use them with some thicker plastic material. What I recommend if you do that, they actually sell washers that are sized to pop rivets. So you want to put a washer on the bottom, which will prevent it from pulling through the plastic. Okay. Related info, the whole story. Anytime you put a wood screw in, unless you're working out with out on the deck with pressure treated wood, you want to drill a pilot hole. If you don't, you're gonna split the wood out. Mark my word, you'll think you're not, but you're gonna. The other thing a pilot hole typically will make you do is it makes you measure things out. So you decide exactly where you want to put the screws. Lots of different types of drill bits, twist bits, auger bits, brad point bits. We're going to get into that a little bit. There's a couple different masonry bits, spade bits here, or we call them speed bores. Step bits are a great thing to have in your toolbox for drilling either at plastics, Sintra, styrene even, you can use them, and then countersinking bits here. Brad point drill bits, I swear by these. If you want to drill a decent hole in wood, you want to use a brad point bit. They're easy to center. And then the way that they're cut, the way the end is cut, they grab, you don't get a lot of tear out, you'll get a nice clean hole. So make the investment in a set of brad point bits. Forstner bits. They're not cheap, but if you've had the breakout that you get when you try using a spade bit or a speed bore on a piece of plywood, you won't get it with Forstner bits. The other thing that Forstner bits allow you to do is not drill a penetrating hole. So you can just drill a recessed hole into, I actually use Forstner bits to drill into sign foam when I was doing recesses for some jars. Actually, I used a piece of sign foam to hold all my paints in a drawer. So you want to explore Forstner bits. Hole saws obviously are very usable. You can pick up a cheap kit, or when your kid asks you to put a new doorknob on a door at his house, you're going to buy one anyway. That's how I got mine. Acrylic specific drill bits. How many times have you tried drilling a piece of plexiglass and you almost get through and then the drill bit grabs and the next thing you know, you've cracked the piece of plexi? That's why they make acrylic points. So these have a real steep entry point and they cut like butter. You will not crack the plexiglass if you use acrylic point drills. So I recommend those. Couple tools that you want to have: get an automatic center punch. You can use this in wood, use it on styrene, use it on metal. This is the one from Harbor Freight for $4. Basically, this is a spring loaded. So all you do is you position it on your crosshairs and push down and it'll snap and it'll give you a point to, for your drill bit to find. The other thing you want to have, and we talked about this back in week 3, is a drill block. It helps you drill it perpendicular to the surface, and it'll help you align it. And again, all these marks that are on the sides help you find the center of the hole that you want to drill. So, cool chart. I've just found this up on the web. You'll notice, a lot of times people reference numbers for drill bits. So this shows all the numbers, starting with the number 80 bit down to a number 1 bit. There are letter designations for bits, A through Z, and then there's metric sizes as well as decimal sizes of bits. So this is just a real good cross-reference. I'll try to, when I get done here, I'll try to find the site and then I will put this up in the chat area. Make the investment. I did, it costs $100 or whatever, but I bought a full drill index. And basically I've got everything that I need. Again, mine is just like this. It goes down to a number 60. Less than that, I'm buying them from Micro Mart, so. So tool of the week this week is a frother. $7. It's basically a little paint mixer. What you don't want to do with this is pull it in and out of the paint though, because then it's going to aerate it. But especially if you have something that's been sitting on a shelf for a while, this is a great way to break it up, and then you could just rinse it off. And frankly, if you burn it out, it's $7. So I've actually been using this now. I've been experimenting with different ways to do concrete. And I'm actually, I'll show you, I found this thing called Rockite, which is, it's a concrete made just for fasteners, and it's incredibly fine. And it's so far it's working out. So I'll have more on that in the future. But anyway, the milk frother, I just found it. It's a lot of fun, and I've been using it lately. So tonight's neat website, McMaster.com. McMaster Car is a godsend. They have everything. They have warehouses all across the country. You get stuff typically in one day, or two at most. And just to give you an idea, we'll look at screws and bolts. And if we want to look at carriage bolts, and we want to look at medium strength, grade 5, they have everything. There's no minimum orders, and you don't need to open an account with them. It's just a great resource if you need anything that has to do with, they have electrical stuff, they have all kinds of stuff. It's just a giant warehouse of hardware. So McMaster, and it's actually just McMaster.com. All right. So next week, we're going to look at making the cut. We had a little bit from Martin last week, I think it was, on cutting. I want to talk a little bit more specifically about blades, both saw blades and knife blades, and the architecture around them and how that affects the cutting that we do. And we'll look at choppers, and then we're going to talk about chatter again, because chatter is a very critical thing when we're cutting up wood. So that's it for me tonight. Any questions or comments, or let me know if I did something wrong?
Well, I'll tell you,
Lots of neat stuff, Bob. Thanks.
Thank you.
yeah, the one thing you didn't mention about those Robinson square drives, it's a wedge fit. When you put the screw on the end of that, I'll use the number 2s. When you put
Yes,
it on
that's
there,
right.
it stays there,
Yeah,
and you can put it into with one hand, put it into some accessible spot, pull the trigger, and bam, it's in there.
exactly. Yeah, I just love them. So, but that's just me. And we'll talk about them a little. When I switched over to them was actually when I started doing pocket hole joinery with Craig tools, because all the Craig stuff is the square drive. And that's when I fell in love with them. So thank you all. Appreciate it.
Bob, I think you did a great job. I learned a lot, at least. I never heard of some of that stuff.
Well, thank you.